Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this important congressional briefing on music, arts, and social emotional learning, working together for positive student outcomes. My name is Lynn Tuttle, and it is my honor to serve as the Director of Public Policy for the National Association for Music Education. NAfME is more than 100 years old and works to ensure equitable access to music education for all students. We are excited to have congressional staff as well as music and arts education advocates joining us for today's briefing. I would like to thank Senator Tester for sponsoring this event and for his ongoing work in support of music and arts education. NAfME takes seriously the work to create a supportive policy environment for music education, and we're fortunate to do so in partnership with more than 30 music and education organizations and companies brought together as the Music Education Policy Roundtable. At the end of the briefing, we will share the Roundtable's current appropriations request for well-rounded education funding, but we'll put a link of that information in the chat for you right now in case you need to leave early. Before I introduce our moderator for this afternoon, I just want to give a thanks to many of our wonderful partners helping us out today, including the Country Music Association Foundation, our colleagues at NAMM, the National Association of Music Merchants, and of course, Senator Tester's office for helping us with today's briefing. And now I'd like to turn it over to Bob Morrison, who will be our moderator today. Bob is one of the leading voices for music and arts education, advocacy, and data in our nation. He helped found Save the Music Foundation and helped build Music for All. He created Quadrant Research, the group leading the way to help make public longitudinal data around access and opportunities in music and arts education across the nation. Today, he also serves as Executive Director of the Arts Education New Jersey and is the Executive Director for the recently launched Center for Arts Education and Social Emotional Learning. Bob, thank you again for being here, and thanks for being such an amazing music and arts education advocate and supporter.
Great, thank you, Lynn. And it's a pleasure to be here with you today and an honor to be moderating this panel this afternoon. And we want to welcome you to our congressional briefing on the topic of music and arts education and social emotional learning, working together for positive student outcomes. Today's briefing is being hosted by Senator Jon Tester of Montana, and I'd like to thank Senator Tester for his dedication and support of music and arts education, both through his own practice and as a legislator. And joining us today from Senator Tester's office is his legislative assistant, Katie Rubinger, who has been working diligently with music and arts education advocates to support music and arts education at the federal level. Welcome, Katie.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me and happy to join today. Better late than never. I don't know, anyone on the call may know that we were supposed to have this briefing last March, but COVID had different plans. After the year, though, that we've all had, I think this conversation is even more relevant now. Of course, the pandemic has impacted students in every corner of the country, and music education is just one of the supports that our students need, maybe now more than ever. Music and arts education is critical for students' social and emotional learning. I'm looking forward to the panelists' discussion on this topic. And I know Senator Tester wishes he could be here, but he did send a quick video about his experience with music education first, so I will let him take it away.
Hi there, Jon Tester here, former music teacher some 40 years ago plus. But look, I ended up getting my degree in music because it's one of the things in school that I excelled at. It might not surprise some of you. I probably wasn't the best kid in the classroom, but I could blow the hell out of a trumpet. And I'll just tell you that because of that, my math skills improved, my overall GPA improved, and ended up getting a scholarship to go to college because of music. It is critically important, especially at this time when school boards all across this country are looking at ways to cut budgets, and they always look at music first. Should be looking at music last, because it's one of those programs that helps build self-esteem, self-confidence, and builds kids for living in the 21st century. Good luck. I'll continue to fight for you to make sure you have the resources you need from the federal level. Why? Because what you do is very important. Thanks for being a music educator.
Great. Thank you, Katie, and thank you to Senator Tester. Now, while social emotional learning has been around for more than 2 decades, it has recently been an emerging educational priority as our school leaders have confronted the ever-increasing signs of stress and trauma our students are experiencing. The alarming rise in teen mental health issues, which are now appearing as early as our middle schools and late elementary schools, social media shaming, ghosting, peer pressure, school shootings have all contributed to what is clearly a mental health crisis in our schools and society. And all of this was occurring prior to COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated these issues due to missed milestones like graduations and concerts, proms, trips, athletic events, student activities, and travel. There's trauma, loss, loneliness, and even questions regarding career aspirations and finding a successful pathway to one's own passion in life. The confluence of student mental health and well-being and the COVID-19 pandemic has thrust the need for social emotional learning front and center for our students as they return to their schools. And it's clear that long after this fiscal and public health crisis recedes from our view, the mental health crisis will remain for years to come. Now, Congress has already recognized the importance of social emotional learning in the Every Student Succeeds Act, with specific references to SEL in Title I, Title II, and Title IV. Additionally, the U.S. Department of Education's just released guidance for district use of funds under the American Rescue Plan explicitly calls on school districts to reserve 20% of these funds, nearly $26 billion, for social emotional learning and related activities. And over the past few years, there's been increasing recognition about the unique connection between arts education and social emotional learning. In fact, noted SEL pioneer Dr. Maurice Elias from the Rutgers Social Emotional and Character Development Lab stated, "I believe everyone will soon come to realize that our arts educators are the secret weapon to the implementation of social emotional learning in our schools." It is this very connection that we will explore today, how music and arts education and social emotional learning are working together for positive student outcomes. And we're fortunate to have some of the leading practitioners from the field to discuss this topic. Joining us are Dr. Uriel Lashley, who is the Director of Arts at the Professional Learning and Community Education, otherwise known as PLACE, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's the Director of Student Empowerment at the new Center for Arts Education and Social Emotional Learning. Darlene Machakan, who is an elementary music educator at Garden Grove Unified School District and also a piano teacher. Dr. Scott Egger is the Associate Professor of Music at Lake Forest College and the Director of Practice and Research at the Center for Arts Education and Social Emotional Learning. And lastly, to get us started, please welcome my favorite former school administrator. She was a senior administrator in St. Louis, in Houston, and Chicago public schools. She's a senior staff advisor for the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, better known as CASEL. And many people don't know this, but she started her career as a dance educator. Please welcome Dr. Pamela Randall Gardner. Hi, Pamela.
Hi, Bob. Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be with all of you here today to have this really interesting discussion that I know is about to take place. So thank you. I'm pleased to be with all of you. I'd like to start this talking a little bit about CASEL. And you just heard Bob say that CASEL is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. We're headquartered here in Chicago. We've been collaborating with SEL experts, leading experts in the field of SEL for over 25 years now. And our mission is to help make SEL an essential part, an integral part of education for all students. We do this by advancing SEL to build more equitable learning environments for all students so that students feel welcomed, they feel supported, they feel that they're in an environment where they can learn and thrive. We do this by driving the research behind social and emotional learning, by guiding the practice of SEL, and also through informing policies so that we can hopefully have a systemic structures in place to support this work in every classroom, in every district across this nation. Our work is grounded in our 5 core competencies. Those competencies are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, responsible decision-making, and positive relationship skills. And so some of you may be asking, so how do we define SEL? Well, CASEL's definition for SEL is that we know it's an integral part of education and human development, that it's a process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, to manage emotions, to achieve personal and collective goals, to feel and show empathy for others, to establish and maintain positive and supportive relationships, and to hopefully make responsible and caring decisions. We've really been focused lately, especially in the last few years, on building transformative learning environments where students are able to build positive and healthy identities, where they feel a sense of agency in co-creating their educational experience, working with teachers and principals and out of school time providers, a full community, so that they feel like they have some agency in co-creating what they want to learn and how they want to learn. And also, most importantly, especially now, in developing environments where students feel a sense of belonging and connection to their school. So I'm happy to be part of this conversation. There's a natural affinity, as we all know, between SEL and the arts. And again, thank you so much for having me this afternoon.
Great, thank you very much, Pamela. And our next panelist literally wrote the book. Actually, he wrote 3 books on the topic of SEL and music education. He is the newly appointed as the Director of Practice and Research at the Center for Arts Education and Social Emotional Learning, and is the Music Education Chair at Lake Forest College. Please welcome my colleague, Dr. Scott Edgar. Welcome, Scott.
Bob, thank you so much. And thank you so much for NAfME, for NAMM, for CMA, and Senator Tester for sponsoring this event. Let me start by asking you a question. If you had to come up with a theme song for how the pandemic has affected you, what would it be? What is your pandemic theme song? Let's think about that. Take a couple seconds and think, is it Superman? Is it Twilight Zone? Is it REO Speedwagon's Riding the Storm Out? Whatever we have with our hearts. If I would have started with that question saying, how has the pandemic affected you? It would have gotten a greatly different answer. Music and the arts can provide a space, an accessible, deep, and meaningful space to start to look at things that are affecting us profoundly. It is a way to deepen and express ourselves. Composer Alex Shapiro from Washington State had this to say: what we are doing by teaching social and emotional learning through music is giving these students a portal. It's a portal inward towards their heart and a portal outward to the world around them. But let's look at that power of music and the arts. What is unique about music and the arts that truly makes it a space special for social and emotional learning? Well, we just have some new research from the folks at Sound United, and they found that 3 out of 4 Americans say that music has been key to improving their mental health during the pandemic. Further, check this out, 70% of Americans surveyed as part of this study said they would give up social media before they give up music. It is central to our space in our lives and central to our mental health. The power of music and arts education for social and emotional learning is profound. We see our students more than any other teacher in the building. It's called developmental relationships. As we see them year after year after year, they trust us. They come together in our space. As Pamela said, we facilitate belonging. We facilitate identity. And we don't just talk about music and the arts, we do it. It's developmental experiences. As we engage in music and the arts, we engage with life, our students' life outside of the classrooms and our students' life inside the classrooms. This personal connection to music and the arts is central to how we can help our students better define their identity. Let's look at resilience. It's one of the buzzwords, but such an essential skill that we need now. When we are engaging in music and artistic processes, there's always a road bump. There's always a speed bump, and we have to overcome. We have to keep on going and persevere. As we're learning to persevere through music and the arts, we're learning to persevere through life. Self-awareness. When I put music and art out there, folks, I see myself. I see my strengths. I see my weaknesses. I cannot hide from music. It is a mirror of what I have on my inside. And then school connectedness. We are all longing for a space of safety and trust and belonging. And for our students who come to our schools for music and arts, it's the reason they show up. It's the air that they breathe. It is their identity. But it doesn't happen on accident. There's no magical SEL fairy that comes into music and arts classroom and says, poof, self-aware. Our music teachers are making an intentional choice to do so. High standards have been difficult during the pandemic, especially in music and the arts. It has affected music and arts in a profoundly different and traumatic way than other content areas. There was a choice for our music and arts teachers, and they made the choice to make it a space for social and emotional growth, for SEL and the arts to be a path for our students to encounter this profoundly challenging year. But they made a choice to make it embedded, to make it artistic. So it was never arts and music. Stop SEL, arts and music. It was embedded in a natural way. It was intentional. They made a choice and said, we are going to help our students socially and emotionally. And it was sustained. It wasn't just a blip on the radar. While we have had to adapt what we have done in music and the arts for physical safety, that adaptation has been a gift. It has been a gift to reach our students in a new and deep way. It has been a gift to be able to help our students explore their own identity, to give them space to have belonging in our classrooms where there was trust, and they were able to put themselves out there even when we've been told, oh, you're within 6 feet of me, I can't trust. They still trust in our classrooms. An agency where their voice can make a difference. Dr. Christy Wilson, president of the American School Superintendents Association, had this to say about SEL and the arts. As our public school system leaders continue to seek ways to support diverse populations, the intersection between arts education and social and emotional learning provides a perfect opportunity to amplify student voice. Arts environments coupled with social and emotional learning infuses the love of learning among learner and adult, ultimately strengthening relationships, improving academic performance and outcomes in public education. This undoubtedly will impact lives forever, end quote. The arts are social. The arts are emotional. When we support music and arts education, we support a space where social and emotional growth is powerful when this work is embedded into the artistic process intentionally and sustained. Choral music educator in Round Lake, Illinois, Bobby Olson had this to say: choose to embed SEL into our classrooms. Over the course of my career teaching music, and even more frequently during the pandemic, students have reported that choir is the highlight of their school day. They find that our musical activities provide avenues of self-expression and social connection in a way that nothing else can. Music education, especially when enhanced with SEL strategies, provides our students with a unique opportunity to play and sing while learning about themselves, their classmates, and their communities, skills which will be crucial as we navigate a return to post-pandemic instruction. The results are clear, and many arts educators have produced healthy, productive, and creative spaces to lead our students from trauma back to trusting relationships through music and the arts. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Scott. And now we're going to bring somebody in who's going to take us from theory into the music room. She is an elementary music educator and piano teacher in Garden Grove, California, and a contributing author for the upcoming book, Portraits of Music Education and Social Emotional Learning, which Dr. Edgar had put together. Please welcome Darlene Machakan. Darlene, welcome.
Hi, hello everybody, and thank you, Bob, for that introduction. I'm excited to be with you all today and to paint a picture of what SEL looks like in my elementary music classroom. So I invite you to take a pause, take one deep breath, and just imagine with me. Recently, I asked some of my students, what do you wish a grown-up knew about you right now? These are some of the things they've said. My internet is too laggy. I don't get what we're learning, and I don't think I will ever get it. I wish someone would listen to me. I don't feel safe outside or even in my own virtual classroom. I wish grown-ups would stop comparing me to other students. Next, I want you to picture this. Brightly colored music notes on the walls, xylophones and ukuleles laid out, posters of Beyonce, Bruno Mars, and Ariana Grande on the walls. An elementary music classroom can be seen as a magical place. And so many students walk through our doors needing the arts because it feeds their soul, it helps them blossom, and it connects them deeper to their humanity. We cannot deny the amount of research behind supporting the arts. And there is nothing inherently wrong with sticking to just the music in music classrooms, but only seeing our students as reproducers of the written music they see on a page does not equate to creating spaces that empower our students to become part of social change. In order for SEL to show up in my classroom, I must create the opportunities for it to show up outside of my classroom. That includes doing inner reflection, engaging in critical discussion with other teachers, and seeking the support from administration and colleagues on how to partner with our students' learning and supporting their overall well-being. While I can describe what SEL looks like for my students, it is important that teachers do take the time to practice these skill sets themselves. This includes self-awareness of knowing our power, our privilege, and our biases in the music room, as well as embracing what we do not know and what we are not comfortable with. In light of the recent events of the tragic murders of 8 lost lives in Atlanta, 6 being Asian women, women who looked like me, I've had to make choices deeply rooted in SEL to help me identify, cope, check in with others, and move towards actionable steps. If we teachers are to create safe and brave spaces in our classrooms with SEL, teachers must first acknowledge and affirm the lived experiences that especially our marginalized students bring with them. So that's part of the work that teachers must do outside. What would SEL look like in my music classroom? Well, intentional weaving of SEL is not some isolated time set aside, which is what Dr. Scott Edgar mentioned. It sounds more like affirmations that center on joy, identity, and excellence. SEL done right is not teacher-centered, but is done with students instead of being done to students. There is also power in the word and, not but. The negative bias in our brains want to upfront this word, such as, oh, but I don't have enough time, but I have to teach this instead. But what about cross-curricular connections? It is possible to teach SEL and the arts. 2 aspects of SEL that I do in my music room that can actually resonate throughout all grade levels are these. Number 1, the power of stories, and number 2, the normalized presence of safe and brave discussion. It is beyond showcasing the final product and performance after behind the scenes practicing, but it is the process and the perspectives that we allow our students to have to build their understanding and to build their acceptance of the beautiful differences people around them have. The student outcomes I aim to have with SEL can be best remembered with the acronym SEA, safety, empowerment, and affirmation. Students can feel safe when they see themselves in our materials. As an elementary music educator, safety doesn't happen until students can feel like they see themselves and are valued in the materials. Diverse children's literature has been one of the gateways for building skills on kindness, resilience, and emotion identification. And I have been intentional in finding stories that highlight my students, especially stories of people who look like them. One story I've used was Rhythm Rescue by Vicki Weber, which is a superhero storybook whose powers of flying and super strength can be activated through clapping notes seen on the page. Throughout the book, we clapped specific rhythm patterns that were part of our musical concept of the day. And we also dreamed of what our superhero powers would be and improvised what rhythm patterns would activate those powers. Not only did we rehearse the new rhythm concept and students demonstrated their learned concept, we got to dream of a world we wish to have. Some superpowers my first graders have said, I want the power to heal, or I want the power to be quick to help people. One student even said, I want the power to make lots of food. And I asked them, why that? And he said, because I want to be able to provide food for my family. We ended up discussing how our superpowers are actually right here in our hearts, our superpowers of being kind and standing up for what's right, that we can be superheroes to people around us. Discussions like these can lead to empowerment. Narratives that start with building empathy can naturally lead to calls to action. Miss Katie Sings, who is a children's music educator, wrote a song with these words: show me how you stand up for what you know is right. If SEL can lead to responsible decision-making, our students must know the why behind these decisions. They need to know how they can make an impact, not just inside their classrooms, but beyond, so it is relevant and can be immediately implemented. I've also worked on not only affirming students' identities, but also affirming who they are as a musician, as an artist, and breaking the expectation that being a music maker is not possible. For my older students, we have reflected on the meaningful discussions of our song lyrics. We used music production skills to create music that was relevant to us. We demonstrated showing empathy by creating music based on stories that we never really seen told. And using platforms like a digital audio workstation allows collaborations where students can learn how to create music together, especially virtually. With this sort of music producer approach, students are able to immerse themselves in music making that is relevant to what they experience outside of our classroom walls. Along with SEL, I also resist seeing my students as learning deficits, but as wealthy carriers of musical knowledge from the experiences they bring. Music education does have standards. Students can increase in musical literacy and their understanding of musical cultures around the globe, create cross-curricular connections, and build social awareness. But when arts education is cut out of schools, it not only erases the opportunities to do what I've just mentioned, but we may possibly be eliminating the meaning of why many of our students show up to school in the first place. A lot of students only come to school for music class or art class or theater class. That is the space where they feel safe, and this is why SEL in the arts works perfectly. The arts can facilitate this to bridge connections to other classroom disciplines. It will provide a gateway to the various avenues students can succeed, and students will feel like their voice truly matters. And I know many of us are probably familiar with the Whitney Houston song, The Greatest Love of All. And she opens up with the words, I believe the children are the future, teach them well and let them lead the way. Well, the children are the future, but we need to listen to that future in order for us to find the steps towards healing and change. Thank you again for giving me the space to share, and I would like to turn it over back to Bob.
Great. Thank you, Darlene. Very, very powerful and impactful comments. We see a lot of comments in the chat about that, and even a question for you if you want to check the Q&A pane. And I also want to give a shout out to all of our attendees who immediately jumped on Scott's initial prompt to name their theme song for the pandemic. I was really getting a kick out of the creative ideas and all the different songs that all of you have shared. So that certainly made my day. Now joining us, our fourth panelist is the Director of Arts at the Professional Learning and Community Education area. Is called PLACE at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he is the newly minted Director of Student Empowerment at the Center for Arts Education and Social Emotional Learning. Please welcome Dr. Uriel Lashley. Uriel, welcome.
Thanks so much, Bob. And thanks everyone for joining us today. As a little bit of background, I just want to share that my own first teaching came as community-based college work through a work study program, right? Many of us, I'm sure on this call probably can remember those days. And I worked at 2 community centers here where I am now in Madison, Wisconsin, for about 6 or 7 years while in college, both as an undergrad and graduate student. And I was becoming a professional musician and decided to move off to New York City after that, and did some work in community-based organizations, directing the arts, actually providing an opportunity for folks in communities all over New York City, 38 different settlement houses essentially to experience the arts. But I found as I was a gigging professional musician and kind of now an art administrator, I missed working with young people. And I had figured out through the college experience that I had some ability to teach them. And I share all this because this was a non-traditional education teaching focused pathway to thinking about social emotional learning. But what I actually did was I had been playing as a drummer and decided to figure out a way that I could actually get back to give something to young people, but are in the world of drumming that I was currently immersed at the time. And I basically founded what we now know as Drum Power, which is a program that teaches West African, Afro-Cuban, and Afro-Brazilian percussion to help young people learn life skills, right? And Drum Power was born by my asking the question, what skills could being and becoming a musician, or in my case, percussionist, help a young person learn or practice that would prepare them for life? And I think I asked this question in some small part because I came from a non-school-based relationship to young people. And because I was teaching art and culture that I knew were not largely part of the mainstream institutional educational expectations that we have, either in terms of curricula or just the priorities and sort of the way I was teaching. But I also initially expected that there were lessons for students beyond what we consider academic and even music skills. So I wanted to create a space and opportunity for practicing these life skills while learning musical skills. And by doing that, I had integrated academic skills, musical skills in this case, not unlike any music teacher, but also done that with social emotional learning skills at the same time. And this was in fact true arts integration, which is another important way that we do this work. We sometimes assume, for example, that arts integration means using art disciplines to teach more historically academic subjects, like using drumming to learn math, for example. But I actually see arts integration as using art-derived priorities and processes and sort of ways of knowing and ways of thinking, whether there's an art form that is actually part of the learning or not. So that's a much broader way of thinking about it. If there are opportunities for one, creativity, secondly, structure, so there's a structure that's provided, and there's also freedom, then that, in my view, is what we really consider the broader arts integration. And one way to think about this further is to just ask ourselves the question, do we usually know how to be creative as we approach math or science? We know that mathematicians do, and so do scientists. So it is our view in terms of thinking about social emotional learning that so should young students, right? Be able to bring creativity and a sense of freedom in addition to the structure to learning these other sorts of skills and academic subjects. So this thinking has led me to focus on facilitating safe spaces for young people, about 3,900 so far, specifically through Drum Power, to be able to practice social and emotional skills, which means to be able to fail, to be able to strive, to be able to triumph, and to do that through artistic explorations and creative expression to really amplify student voice, as Dr. Edgar said before. And this is an important opportunity for students to learn, but also to lead. That's why for Drum Power, the pillars are discipline, which we define as using your energy for good things, which is a very conscious reclamation of that word from some of the negative ways and thoughts that we have around it. But also community, supporting our own learning and the learning of others, and then leadership, doing the right thing, even if we have to do it alone, and especially when no one is watching. So this gets into sort of thinking about character development and students being able to form their own values and make their own meaning of the world in which they live, and then figure out how to successfully move through it. As I wrap up my thoughts, I just want to leave you with thinking about the fact that there's also research-based outcomes that show the impact and the importance of these learning opportunities. I myself conducted a study where researchers interviewed students and collected quantitative survey data on drumming and social emotional learning skill growth over time. And what we found was that students identified 4 main outcomes. The first was feeling personally connected. So that was connecting to the drumming or that classroom and friends and their own personal histories around the work that they were doing with one another. The second was my teacher as a trusted guide and caregiver, which is about the way they saw my role as the instructor of the class and just sort of leading them through the work. And then also third, a sense of the Drum Power classroom as a special space for practicing the pillars of power. So a special space to practice and fine tune social emotional learning skills, but also learn music. And then finally, they express feelings of finding and discovering a sense of their own power. And I believe these are all solid goals for our schools and classrooms to just target as outcomes of all classroom learning more generally, but also as we consider integrating social emotional learning. So I give you the Drum Power example just as one example, as one context, but there are many for the social emotional learning work that we all do. And most of them, I think, start to approach these same sorts of outcomes and have the same goals in mind. So thanks so much for your care and time today, and I look forward to the continued discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Jarrell. And for all of our attendees, I've been dropping into the chat a link to a Google Drive that has lots of resources, some of which we're going to talk, some of which we've talked about, some of which we haven't, that will be useful to you in making the connection between music, arts education, and social emotional learning. So thank you again, Jarrell. That was fantastic. I would like the panelists to please turn your cameras on so we can have a discussion. And I'm going to start with this question. Our schools are dealing with the never before seen challenges. There's the economic crisis, the public health crisis of COVID-19, and now the mental health crisis. Some may ask, with everything that's going on, with so much on their plates, why should connecting to social emotional learning with music and arts education be something that they spend time on now? Why should it be a priority now?
Well, I'm happy.
There you go, Pamela.
I'm happy to start. When COVID hit about a year ago, CASEL was inundated with districts coming to us and saying, we need to focus on the social emotional health of our students, the mental health of our students, and our adults, quite frankly. And over this year, we've heard from districts, we've heard from school leaders and teachers saying that before we think about, been hearing a lot of buzz about learning loss, we need to make sure that we are creating environments where students feel safe, where adults feel safe. They feel like they have a forum or they have a safe space where they can just share their emotions, can share their fears, We also saw that there were a lot of inequities that surfaced as a result of COVID. So we're really saying and supporting districts in providing those safe spaces so that students and adults can heal, so that there is a sense of resiliency that's coming first and foremost before we even think about the academic loss or, you know, the instructional loss that's been taking place. And I'm happy to report that for the most part, in the 22 school districts that we're working in currently, and as we hear anecdotal reports from others, that we're now realizing, and we should have known this prior to COVID, but we're now realizing that all learning is social and emotional. And before we can travel down any kind of algebra class or chemistry class or PE class, that we need to make sure that we're providing those forms, those safe environments, so that students first feel like there's a trusted adult that we just heard Irel talk about. There's a trusted adult that's going to listen, that there's a space for them to unload their emotions and their fears and the inequities that they've experienced. And then they can start thinking about broader focus areas and broader instruction. So
absolutely, Pamela. If I can just go off of that just a little bit, in the music and arts classrooms, as this is a space for connectivity where our students are looking to have their home in the school, we're hearing across the country that when they get back into the brick and mortar buildings, that it's just very quiet, that the students are going back to a familiar environment that is nothing but unfamiliar at this point. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, that we're struggling to see the reality of what we're hoping to see with our music and arts teachers, and to create music and art in a new and adapted way. You bring up this idea of being intentional about this, Pamela, and this is a question that I get often, and try to quantify it. How many minutes do we need to spend on SEL to truly get meaning in our classroom as we get back to this? And the best answer that I've come up with is, if we are truly prioritizing this and changing our culture in our classroom to achieve these objectives, the best answer is all of the minutes. All of the minutes need to be socially and emotionally constructed, and all of the minutes need to be artistic. When we do it from that perspective, it's not an either or, it's an and.
Great. Anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah,
Well,
I would just also add that anytime there's learning going on, then social emotional learning skills are being engaged. And so basically, if you're learning academics or you're learning anything really, it requires the skills to just inform students making choices around deciding to focus, the resilience to keep working, even when things are not new. When things are new, and then when they're scary or challenging. And that's akin to responsible decision making. Having some idea of your own personal awareness and positive self-identity is required to be able to make those choices healthily and sort of just respond in that way. Learning with the community requires collaboration, which also empathy, which is indeed social awareness, and on and on. So you really can't have any learning or evolution of students in positive ways without social emotional learning. And so then it just becomes an issue of whether you're explicitly connecting students to that so that they can understand what it is they're learning and apply it in different other situations. But those skills are required for learning anyway, so it's not really an additive extra thing.
got it. Thank you, Ro. So another question we have is, we've heard some music and arts educators say that I already do this, meaning that it's inherent in what they do, so there's no reason to focus on this. Is that an accurate statement?
I'll jump in since I sort of ended at this point with the last response, which is, I would say in response to that, as I said, there is no learning without SEL, but it is often not made explicit for young people, which means we're not teaching them to recognize these skills and then to be able to apply them in other situations and throughout life. We call that, as educational psychologists, we call that metacognition, which is essentially thinking about thinking, but sort of realizing the lessons in the experiences that we have and the things that we learn, and then knowing how to apply those skills to our own needs and goals. And so saying that they actually exist, but then not going a step further to really make those connections clear for students is, I would think of a metaphor kind of like, that'd be kind of like learning the alphabet without tying that to that skill to specifically reading words, right? It's related, but it's not the same. And going to the point of making it clear that students can know what they're learning at a certain point, like being able to say, hey, you learned this thing and you got this out of it, and helping them sort of conclude what they gained out of it and what was important to them, then allows them to sort of connect it to other things in their lives and use it on their own and be empowered, rather than just have an experience.
Great. Scott?
Certainly can address it. It goes back to this idea of our work being intentional, embedded, and sustained. And we know that the arts are that fertile ground. That's that connection and all of the different reasons that we've been advocating our entire time today. But as we know, teaching the G-flat scale once or teaching a rhythm once is not going to get follow through. That we need to persevere through the process to build this. Just as we're talking about the skills of music, we're talking about the skills of life. So that sustained piece, that intentional piece. Otherwise, we know that G-flat's not going to go when we put it into practice. Same thing with what we're trying to accomplish here with SEL.
I'd also like to add on, I just think of this phrase, we don't teach music, we teach students, we teach learners, we teach humans. And just like what you've mentioned, Scott, on how, okay, cool, you learned a scale, now what? I also, check in with some of my colleagues, some of my friends who aren't musicians, but who have taken music lessons. And a lot of the times they will say, oh, my music teacher yelled at me because I couldn't get this right. Or, oh, I have pen marks from the one time my piano teacher scolded me because I couldn't get that right. And I think, is that what we want to be remembered as music teachers who are constantly correcting mistakes, or as someone who truly sees students for who they are and connected with them? So I think with this, we have to truly think big picture and think, what is the one thing we want students to have? So sometimes even nowadays, I'm going to be real about my situation. I've been teaching virtually since March 2020. I am in my classroom right now. Students are back, but I cannot see them in person due to just the nature of these schedules. And so my planning is just all over the place. But the very forefront, I think, what do my students need right now? If I sign on Zoom and kids show up thinking, oh my gosh, I'm so stressed, it's not important for us to drill rhythm flashcards right now. We just need a time to check in. So I think it is more about having that mindset and that framework, because at the end of the day, especially as an elementary music teacher, I don't know if all of these kids will enroll in a music program later on. So I would want their memories of having a music education to be a good one where they feel seen and heard and seen as humans.
Great, thank you.
And Bob, I was just going to add that in terms, because we hear this question a lot, especially around intentionality, around social and emotional terms. And I think back to when I was a dancer, I had to learn what a plie was, what a dégagé was, what tendu is, what an arabesque is. Just like I was expected to learn those words and the corresponding actions, it's the same way with social and emotional learning. A lot of times teachers think that these students are coming to them and they should already have these skills in hand. We know that that's not the case. We know that there are adults who haven't mastered, and we never master all of our social and emotional learning skills. It's a lifelong process. So in the interest of building a common language around being able to say, I'm feeling angry right now, I'm self-aware enough to know that I'm angry or I'm joyful, or that I'm making a responsible decision because I chose to go to that art class as opposed to hanging out with my friends, or that I'm making a responsible decision to become engaged with my community. We need to build that muscle around social emotional learning terms and skills so that students and adults are able to apply those skills and they're cognizant of the skills that they're learning so that they are able to apply them when the situation arises. So I'm all about intentionality and building that common language. Yes, we do need to be intentional now.
Great, thank you. So I just want to throw out one more comment and then one last question for the panel, and then we'll go. There's some rich questions coming in the Q&A pane. And I hear from some of the educators saying, they've been sidelined as there's been a greater focus on quote unquote academics as opposed to the arts education programs. And I hear that frustration and I see that. And I certainly recognize that. But the point that I want to make is around this idea of learning loss. There's a lot of conversation right now about learning loss and what does that mean as our students return to school and how do we make up for that? And when I hear that term, the historical approach to learning loss has been remediation. And remediation historically means we take stuff away from students so they can focus on the things that need to be remediated. In this environment, that's not going to fly. We can't bring our students back into school and start taking the things that they've missed the most away from them. That is going to be a failure in serving the needs of our students. So I think that one of the things that we need to be talking about, both at the federal level when we're talking about how do we accelerate learning? Because learning hasn't been lost, it's been delayed. But how do we accelerate that learning? And how do we at the same time ensure that we re-engage our students in those things that define who they are, what they want to be involved in? We need to be focusing on their needs. So I'm going to stop and get off my soapbox to give my last question to the panelists, and then we'll go to some of the questions that are coming in from the chat. So how might the intersection of arts education and social emotional learning be used as a vehicle to engage and empower students as they return to in-person learning?
Well, I'll jump in again. I have that very statement in front of me, right here next to my computer, that we know that the arts education, and many times, is the hook that's going to keep students connected to school. It is a vehicle for self-expression, for creativity. It's a vehicle for building self-confidence. So it's critically important, especially now. And Senator Tester talked about this too, that there might be other subject areas that students aren't doing as well as they would hope. But for a lot of our students, and for me as a dancer in high school, that was my draw to school. That was my connection to school. That's where, all of my friends were in the dance studio. And that was my reason, my energizer every morning as I got ready to go to high school and on through college. So we have to recognize when we think about we talk about students having some agency and building what they want to learn and how they want to learn. That's part of this transformative SEL environment that we're trying to create, that we're listening to students and hearing them say, this is where I'm going to excel, and this is where I need the supports, and I need high quality instruction so that I can become the artist that I want to be. It should not be used as an afterthought. It really, we have to recognize and honor and support that for a lot of these students, these arts classes, along with the social and emotional learning environment that's being created, is what's keeping those students connected to school, especially given what we've been going through in the past year.
Other comments? That's great, Pamela.
I would just add to that, that, prior to the pandemic, students were receiving remediation too. And disproportionately, those were students of color and students with individual education plans and so forth and so on. And there was no addition by subtraction then either, meaning if you pull students out of one sort of instruction that they need to get a different type of instruction that you know they also need, but you decide, and maybe correctly so, that they need more. We still got to figure out how to give them the other thing that they're missing. And so I don't think that's changed. And I think those of us that are really approaching this as creatively as we can are going to take the reality of the pandemic and the obvious boost in what we know and what we can do and how we think about virtual learning, to not try to go back to what we were doing before, but to create something better for students. And I think social and emotional learning, especially if it's fully integrated in all the curricular learning that we see in schools, and especially utilizing music, but all the arts, can be an important tool and vehicle toward doing that for all the reasons that all of us on the panel have shared to this point.
Darlene, I'm going to come to you for maybe a final comment on this particular topic of student empowerment, student engagement.
Yeah, sure. I'd like to also come back to how we talked about transformative SEL, particularly in the lens of equity. So we mentioned the words engagement and empowerment, which I feel like if we're not intentionally looking towards that lens, then it is possible that our classrooms, even when creating SEL and the arts intersecting with one another, it could create an environment where students are not interested, or they, instead of feeling empowered, they feel oppressed. And I think that's important that, you know, with my other point of seeing students' lived experiences are very important, because there is conversation of how shallow implementation of SEL could actually do more harm than good. Dina Simmons said it best. I mean, these words are very strong, but she said it could be white supremacy with a hug. And I think for our Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian students, we need to not just go the easy answer and say, oh, I don't see in this way, but I think, okay, we have to hear what they have to say and see how their experiences take a factor in our social emotional learning skills. And so we have to be careful in how we amplify our students of color and not see them as, okay, I'm just going to all of a sudden talk about Indigenous people, but it's very hard for someone to really see themselves amplified if all of a sudden we just put it out of nowhere when we haven't created that safe space from the very beginning. So instead of, you know, going along with that sense of urgency and doing what everybody's doing and thinking, oh, SEL is trending, I have to do it, it's important that we, like I said before, do the work outside and reflecting and be like what we want to model for our students, be a lifelong learner, because our students see us, and if they see us as learners too, then of course they're going to build that connection with us as well. So there are a lot of perspectives and different takes on seeing this, but I feel like it's definitely something has to be sustained throughout time.
Great, thank you, Darlene. And I want to remind everyone that we're dropping into the chat links to a Google Drive that has a lot of resources available. One of the resources includes the opening chapter from the new book, Portraits of Music Education and Social Emotional Learning. And that chapter was written by Darlene. So if you didn't get enough of Darlene here, you can go download the book chapter and see the resources in the Google Drive that we're dropping here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lynn and Tushar so that they can help us with some of the questions that have been coming in from the attendees. So Lynn, Tushar.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks to everyone for putting fantastic questions into the Q&A pane. I know we won't be able to get to all of them, but so here's a question, and I think it's one that could come up perhaps less in the arts room than with our colleagues down the hall and other academic subjects. But what do you say to teachers that may not want to incorporate SEL in the classroom due to pressures on them from administration to meet academic standards or a focus on performance? How would you respond?
Well, I would say that it goes back to what I said earlier, that we know, and you can look at the Aspen Institute, they just had a wonderful report that came out a couple of years ago, that we know that all learning is social and emotional, that you cannot, if you have a teacher that's standing before students and there's no connection there, there's no relationship, there's no trust there, no learning is going to happen, period, full stop. So in order for learning to happen in whatever content area, arts or not, there has to be that connection. There has to be that sense of community and belonging and ability for students to take a risk in order to make a mistake, to learn from that mistake. So again, I go back to when I hear that from teachers, I say, well, nothing is going to be retained or learned by students if you don't first have that social and emotional connection.
Lynn, just translating that for music and the arts, so oftentimes we've painted ourselves into a corner where the concert is the end all be all, and prioritizing both the process and the product. And the concern is, oh, how am I going to get everything ready for the concert if I have to spend time on social and emotional learning in addition to everything else? And the answer is, when it's embedded into the process, everything else happens at a higher level. The reflection happens, the self-awareness happens, the identity, the belonging, the agency happens, and the process is more streamlined. So for the teacher who is in that mindset of I'm getting ready for a concert, I would argue a stitch in time saves nine. And I would argue also that when we start to really get into a process-based focus on the arts, things that are very, very special start to happen.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Lynn, too, and echo all the great points that Pamela and Scott made, and just add to that wholeness, social emotional learning is about wholeness and health, generally. And you're not going to have a good performance in anything, be it an examination or just walking down the street, if you don't feel healthy, and if you don't have the healthy functionality or the ability to just function in the world that you live in, that social and emotional learning seeks to help develop skills around.
Thanks. Bob, do we have time for another question, or do we need to wrap up?
Let's go for another one. I think we have a little more time. We can stretch this for a few minutes.
Great. So great question about what's the connection between SEL and creativity in the arts classroom?
I'll kick it off. So to me, it starts with the creative process, the generative process, that we are engaging our students in the creation of art just as much as we are engaging them in the process of recreating art that was already created. So when we start to ask our students more questions than we're giving their answers, positioning them to have agency in our classroom. I put myself in the role of, I'm a wind ensemble director at Lake Forest College. And if I'm conducting something and something's not going well, my go-to is to say, this is how you fix it. Well, that's not the right question. The question is, we should be positioning our students to say, how can we fix this? So that agency is alive and well in a classroom that typically maybe not hasn't seen a level of agency through our history. And we're changing some of these traditions in a way that's going to amplify students' voices. And the other thing that we are working very hard on right now is to provide more examples from composers, from artists, from choreographers, from playwrights, to get SEL in at the inception of this artistic process, and having these artists work with our students to create their own world, to create their own vision for what art needs to look like in their life.
I guess I would add to that too, and those are great points, Scott, that artistic process, if at heart, I think what engages young people and people in general about making and creating and giving life to art or expressing it is that it is in fact an act of empowerment and a very personal one. So I think that as we think about social and emotional learning, as we think about, and this is true of any type of learning, but I think as you set up spaces where students can practice or try to approach having this sort of an experience, then the focus on empowering them and placing at center their opportunity to creatively express and just create and have meaningful contribution and true ownership has to occur at every level. So that, for example, I think of it as, deciding to stay in a reflection-driven process, whereas as an acronym for the Essence Stay, we select competencies, right, with these ideas or skills that we want students, but students need to be involved in that process, that we're selecting them as a community. And then for the T, we're translating them into actual behaviors and experiences that are real for students, where you can't do that as an adult instructor on your own. That has to be something that's driven by students and what they bring with them and validating their own experience. And then for A, that it's about action, that this lives in, as I said earlier, discipline is using my energy for good things. That's doing something. But it's my energy as a student, not mine as a teacher. And then finally, for youth empowerment, that the goal of all this is driving toward youth empowerment. So at each step of the way, like we have some classrooms where we have routines that are being created without youth empowerment in mind, and without student input, and without thinking about student engagement even. So that can't happen, and there's not going to be an intersection between SEL and arts integration and just SEL in that way if at every step we're not really considering how we center the student voice and student agency.
Great. Well, I think we're running out of time. We're trying to answer some of the questions that are in the chat that we haven't gotten to here. So again, I want to thank our panelists for joining us today. A fantastic conversation. And I do want to build off of this exceptionally informative discussion, particularly for our congressional attendees. First, we want to thank you for your support of public education through the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund and its commitment to social emotional learning. This has the potential to provide more equitable access to music and arts education, but it's up to local districts as to how those funds will be spent. So for our participants that are attending from around the country, this means that's your call to action, is to engage in your local school district to see how these funds are being utilized and to advocate for how they may be spent to support music and arts education as our students come back into school, and how it can support the meaningful integration of social emotional learning in those programs as well. I'd also like to encourage our congressional members to continue to make the connection between student social emotional learning and arts education, and by continuing to prioritize funding for the U.S. Department of Education through Title I, Title II, and Title IV. And that includes a request to fully fund Title IV. And also to continue to support a well-rounded education for all students as articulated in the Every Student Succeeds Act. If we've learned anything throughout this pandemic, it's this. Our commitment to a well-rounded education can not only be for when it's convenient, it also has to be when it's hard, like during a pandemic, like when we return to our schools from a pandemic. And as we return to school, it's critical to remember that our students will not learn until they feel safe, until they feel valued, until they can express themselves, and until they are heard. That is why the intersection between music and arts education and social emotional learning will be so important, so powerful, and you as educators will be so important as our students return to our schools. Thank you all for attending, and back to you, Lynn, to bring us home.
Thank you, Bob. I want to take a moment to thank all of our fabulous panelists. Thank you for sharing your time, your expertise, and your experience with engaging arts education with social emotional learning in the classroom and in your communities. Thanks to Bob and to the NAfME staff for putting all the great links for you in the chat so you can continue to learn more and become more expert in your own practice of intersecting and integrating social emotional learning in what you do in music and arts education classrooms. So thank you for joining us today, for all of the music and arts education advocates joining us. Thank you to the congressional staff members for joining us. A special shout out to Senator Tester and his office for helping us host today's briefing and for his fabulous inspirational words at the beginning. Thank you so much, Katie, for bringing those to us. And thanks to our partners in crime for putting on today's webinar, our colleagues over at NAMM, our colleagues at NAMM Foundation, and of course, the brand new Center for Arts Education and Social Emotional Learning. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.